At a farmer's market, I can meet the person behind the product. I can find out how they made it and if their method of production was ethical. The number of people involved in getting this egg to me is just this one farmer. But most supply chains are a lot longer. Being an ethical consumer means, at least, understanding something about how the products we buy were made and then brought to market. Were any animals treated properly? Were the workers paid well and able to work under decent conditions? Those kinds of questions. So what if there are moral concerns? I met up with Christian Barry in a clothing mill in Melbourne to talk about this.
Lots of options.
Yeah, let's talk first and then we can...
So if you take something like the production of clothing, and suppose we find that many people are working very long hours under very poor conditions, they're not getting breaks, they're under constant threat of dismissal, you name it. There are some bad things that are going on in the production of these goods. And then the question is, okay, but whose responsibility is to do something about it? And so one natural thought might be, well, at the first instance, it's at the level of the factory itself. But when we actually look at the kinds of pressures that the factory owner may be under in that case, the freedom that they may have to actually improve conditions may be quite limited because they may be under competitive pressures with other firms, so that if they actually change substantially what they pay their workers or they improve the conditions, it may well be that it's the factory down the street that's actually getting the contracts that they would otherwise get. So there are competitive pressures at that level. And then you might move on to whether or not, well, isn't the state, are they failing to sort of pass the right kinds of laws or regulations? Well, in many cases, these states do actually have pretty good laws and regulations, and so the question is often why they aren't getting enforced. And there again, some of these countries are very attracted to the fact that they can get economic opportunities by being sort of zones of aggressive exporting. And they too may be under competitive pressure, so they may be worried that if they actually enforce these regulations, or if they actually insist that things like collective bargaining be allowed in the workplace, that the firms that are sourcing their goods from there will move elsewhere. So they too are under a great deal of competitive pressure. And then, of course, it gets to, well, what about the firms themselves? That is, the large retailers who are having these goods produced and then are bringing them to market in countries that people like you and I live in. You might say, well, shouldn't they do something about it? But I think that they are only going to do something about it if they get signals from consumers that it's important for them to do something about it. So effectively, although individuals themselves have very little power, consumers as a bloc have very significant amount of influence over what these firms respond to. If these firms themselves found that it was important to consumers that the goods be sourced in a particular way or that working conditions be of a particular type, they too would be in a great deal of position to sort of push down those requirements down further down the supply chain. So in a sense, it ends up with us, but it also begins with us because we're sending the signals to the retailers, we're sending the signals to the countries and to the factories in those countries about how they actually have to produce things.
OK, so the choices of consumers like us can have a big impact. They give companies a reason to produce their goods in a more defensible way. Using consumer power seems like a good idea. Maybe if we boycotted all the clothes coming out of Bangladesh, we might improve the terrible conditions in the factories there. But this sort of argument might be naive. A boycott could do more harm than good. Christian Barry explains.
Right, so this is a sort of a dilemma that people are often presented with, which is that although people may be working under conditions that seem problematic to us, from their point of view, it's much better than the alternative. And so for them, it's much better if we continue buying goods produced in this way than if we try to source them elsewhere. And to some extent, I think that's simply true, right? So it's certainly true that it's better for them if we continue to buy from them than if we shift our purchasing elsewhere. But I think it's a false dilemma in the sense that it supposes that there are only sort of two options and that your only capacities as a consumer is to either sort of buy or not buy. But there are many other things you can do. You can simultaneously buy while trying to put pressure on the firms that are sourcing goods from these places to improve the conditions there. You can be making countervailing efforts to try to improve or undermine some of the pressures that they're under to make the conditions the way they are.
There are numerous NGOs campaigning to bring about change in the sophisticated way that Christian Barry talks about. Most companies want their product to be associated with a good time, not a bad work practice. Merely publicising some unethical aspect of a supply chain is often enough to bring about change. The consumers who make a choice about whether to buy or not buy are usually people like you and me from wealthy first world countries. Now, it's really easy for us to project our own values and assumptions onto the practices that go on in other countries. When we do this, we're often unaware of crucial aspects of their circumstances. We can all agree that slavery is bad. But what about child labour? Is that as bad as I think it is? In a really poor family, the children could be bringing in vital income. If we apply my first world ideals and take these children away from the labour market, we might push this family over the edge into poverty. We talk about empowerment, but you don't empower someone by taking away their best option. I went down to the docks to meet Kate MacDonald, who talked to me about this. How you doing?
Very well. How are you doing?
Not bad. Watch out for trains, because we're just going to sit right here by the tracks.
OK. In a lot of countries where child labour is widespread, there are a lot of organisations, including child protection NGOs and so on, who are very hostile to the idea that we should just ban child labour and say no children are allowed to work at all until they're 16 or whatever, equivalent to the sorts of laws that we would consider appropriate in a country like Australia. But rather, they focus on managing the child labour in a way that ensures that the children can still have a reasonable education, to give them some opportunity of getting out of the cycle of poverty, and also to ensure that, at the very least, they're not engaging in the worst forms of child labour they're referred to. So things that put the children at risk of physical injury or harm or damage them in some way. So, it's not that those organisations would advocate child labour or think that it's really great, to toughen up the children or something. It's just recognising the realities of people living in a situation of poverty and trying to come up with solutions that can help children to be safe, that can help them to get an education while recognising the realities of their circumstances.
Deciding what is ethical in a supply chain is starting to look like a really difficult thing to determine. For this reason, it's wrong to act as if the problem is simple when really it's not. To help us work through these complexities, there are apps that tell us what we're really buying. There are also recognised certifications, from recycled paper through to sustainable palm oil, that have built up a good reputation. Best known among these might be the Fair Trade logo.
One of the big things that Fair Trade tries to deal with is the prices that farmers get paid for the coffee or the cocoa beans or whatever that they produce. And so one of the assurances that the Fair Trade label tries to give you is that the farmers producing the products have been paid a fair price, which isn't always the case in free markets that are operating for those products. And then there are also other social programs, additional social premiums, they call it, to support development in the communities that are supported by Fair Trade, as well as they put quite a lot of emphasis on developing sort of self-help organisations through cooperatives or workers' groups, so that the people are able to be empowered, actually. So Fair Trade is actually one of the schemes that explicitly tries to do that. Other schemes are more focused on just sort of protecting basic standards and making sure that health and safety standards are protected, people aren't spraying dangerous chemicals without protective gear, making sure that environmental standards around land use or water use or pollution or whatever is protected. So there are a lot of different issues that these schemes can try to address. Some are more focused on poverty, some are more focused on labour rights, some are more focused on environmental issues. So they do vary.
Given how hard it is for you and me to know whether a supply chain is ethical, how can we really expect companies and retailers to always know? Can a company claim that having an ethical supply chain in a modern globalised economy is just going to be a known unknown?
I think that often what sellers know depends on what it's important to them to know. So they know a great deal about various things about the materials that may be used in their goods.
We'll get some of that, please.
If they think that these are important to their consumers, they know very much about the price structure, they know very much about what's going to change and what the possible fluctuations in the prices that they face will be. They may not know very much about labor standards. They may not know about whether or not people are allowed to have bathroom breaks or what their wages are, because they just don't care. And they don't care because it's also they're getting signals from their consumers that their consumers don't really care either. So the things that matter to them, they make it in their business to know. The things that don't matter to them, they don't typically take it in their business to know. Now, there may be some markets where, I mean, I think that in particular cases, there's always the possibility that you simply don't know or you couldn't know. But I think that's sort of an exception rather than the rule.
As consumers, we're not going to solve this problem on our own through individual action. But we can at least learn about what we're being sold. And companies will adapt their practices once they know that their customers care about this. Thank you. Ethical consumption is complicated, but sometimes acting ethically requires being aware of complexities. We should want to know about the injustices that occur, but we also should want to know about the conditions in the source countries and the range of feasible alternatives on offer before drawing any conclusions. What do you think? Next time, are you responsible for the past?